From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
They're the most important elections, I would say, ever in India since we became independent. Everyone's fighting for their survival on all sides, the right, the left, the center, ordinary people, wealthy people, everyone. And it's an election that no one is going to win.
The acclaimed Indian writer Arundhati Roy joins us for the hour to talk about the Indian elections and why she opposes Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We'll also talk about the rise of global authoritarianism, her new nonfiction collection, My Seditious Heart, and the crisis in Kashmir.
Now there's a sort of bold confrontation between the army and the people who are becoming increasingly militant.
Today, Arundhati Roy, the author of The God of Small Things and the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, for the hour. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Sweden, prosecutors are reopening an investigation into sexual assault allegations against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and are seeking his extradition to face charges in Sweden. Prosecutors had dropped the investigation in 2017 because they said the case could not proceed while Assange was holed up at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he lived for 7 years before being forcefully removed by British police last month. Julian Assange has since been sentenced to 50 weeks in jail in Britain for skipping bail in 2012 to avoid extradition to Sweden. He was ultimately concerned about being extradited to the United States. Assange has denied the sexual assault accusations. He previously faced another sexual misconduct allegation, but its statute of limitations expired in 2015. WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, Kristen Hrafnsson, said, quote, "Since Julian Assange was arrested on April 11th, there has been considerable political pressure on Sweden to reopen their investigation. But there's always been political pressure surrounding this case. Its reopening will give Julian a chance to clear his name. This case has been mishandled throughout," he said. The United States is also seeking Assange's extradition over the publication of leaked documents by Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning, which showed evidence of U.S. war crimes in Iraq. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has canceled a visit to Moscow today. Instead, is heading to Brussels to meet with European leaders to discuss, quote, recent threatening actions and statements from Iran, according to the State Department. The nature of the threats have not been specified, but the U.S. announced it's sending additional bombers and an aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf to act as a deterrent. The European Union reiterated today its continued support for the Iran nuclear deal in the face of mounting tensions with the U.S. Meanwhile, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani has called for internal unity as the nation faces sanctions that could have worse consequences than war with Iraq in the 1980s, and that he said amount to, quote, a war unprecedented in the history of our Islamic revolution, unquote. As tensions rise in the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia is claiming 2 of its oil tankers were damaged in what it describes as a sabotage attack off the coast of the United Arab Emirates. The Saudi energy minister said one of the ships was due to pick up Saudi oil to deliver to the United States. The attacks reportedly caused damage to the vessels, but no casualties or oil spills. Last week, the U.S. warned Iran or its proxies could be targeting ships in the region. Iran responded to the latest news by warning about a conspiracy orchestrated by ill-wishers to undermine the region. In environmental news, nearly all the countries in the world have agreed to curb plastic waste, except the United States. In a landmark agreement, 187 governments agreed to add plastic to the Basel Convention, a treaty that regulates the movement of hazardous materials between countries. The U.S. was not involved in the negotiations because it's one of just 2 countries that has not signed the treaty. The amended treaty will make it more difficult for rich countries to send their plastic waste to poorer nations. The UN estimates there are 100 million tons of plastic waste in the world's oceans. This is the UN's Ralph Payet.
Plastic is everywhere. And we need, for us to solve it, it cannot be the responsibility of only one country. It has to be all the countries of the world, all consumers, all organizations have to come together, including the private sector, the plastic producers, have to come together for us to find a solution.
Trade talks between the United States and China ended Friday without a deal, as President Trump followed through on his threat and imposed a 25% tariff on over $200 billion of Chinese goods and accused China of trying to renegotiate a deal. A U.S. trade representative said Friday Trump also planned to raise tariffs on the $300 billion worth of remaining Chinese imports. Both parties said talks will eventually resume, and White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow indicated Trump could meet with President Xi Jinping at the G20 meetings in Japan next month. Meanwhile, in an interview with Fox News' Chris Wallace Sunday, White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow admitted U.S. companies and consumers will effectively end up paying for the increased tariffs, contradicting a statement by Trump last week that China would mostly pay for them.
The president says it pays the tariffs. They may suffer consequences, but it's U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers who pay, correct?
Yes, to some extent. I don't disagree with that.
The Pentagon said Friday it will redirect $1.5 billion from other military projects to fund President Trump's border wall. The Associated Press reported the funds would be diverted in part from the Afghan Security Forces Fund from a project to destroy chemical munitions as part of the Chemical Weapons Convention and from Air Force programs. This comes after the Pentagon already redirected $1 billion of military funds in March. Democrats blasted the news and accused the Pentagon of again circumventing Congress and prioritizing Trump's campaign promises over more urgent needs, including disaster relief. In Afghanistan, women's rights advocates are calling for justice after two gunmen shot dead a prominent former broadcast journalist and government advisor in Kabul Saturday. Mina Mangal was killed on her way to her job at the Afghan Cultural Affairs Commission. Days earlier, Mangal posted on social media she was receiving threats and feared for her life. In more news from Afghanistan, authorities say they've captured the Taliban intelligence chief responsible for last week's attack on police headquarters in the northern province of Baghlan that killed at least 13 officers and wounded dozens of others, including civilians. In Pakistan, a Saturday attack on a luxury hotel in the port city of Gwadar has killed at least 5 people, according to local reports. 4 hotel employees and a Special Forces soldier died in the raid that was claimed by separatist group the Baloch Liberation Army. In Burkina Faso, gunmen have shot dead 6 people, including a priest, during the celebration of Mass in a church in the north of the country before burning down the church. Attacks by extremist militias have been on the rise since 2017, although no group has claimed responsibility for Sunday's killing. The UN reported at least 65 people drowned when a boat carrying migrants across the Mediterranean sank Friday. The migrants came from a range of countries, including Bangladesh, Libya, Morocco, and several sub-Saharan African nations. This is a survivor of the shipwreck from Egypt, Mandur Mohammed.
There were 75 of us. We sailed a little bit then. Because of how many people were on the boat started filling up with water. It then sunk and capsized. This was 12 o'clock at midnight. We kept floating in the water until 8 o'clock in the morning. A small Tunisian boat then came to our rescue. They came and took us, along with the Tunisian army. Thank God we are here in Tunis.
Although the number of migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean has gone down since its peak in 2015, the UN warns the journey is increasingly fatal for those who undertake it. According to the International Organization for Migration, nearly 2,300 migrants died or went missing in the Mediterranean last year. In Gaza, mourners gathered over the weekend for the funeral of 24-year-old Abdullah Abdalal, who was shot and killed by Israeli forces during Friday's Great March of Return. Another 30 people were injured at the weekly demonstration along the separation barrier with Israel. The killing comes amidst a fragile ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, following a series of deadly clashes the previous weekend that killed 25 Palestinians and 4 Israelis. Last week, the UN warned 1,700 Palestinians with gunshot wounds to their limbs may have to undergo amputations because of a lack of funding for reconstruction surgery and other medical treatments. The UN reports 29,000 Palestinians have been injured while taking part in the Great March of Return protests over the past year, of which 7,000 had gunshot wounds, mostly in the legs. $20 million is needed to make up for the shortfall in funding. Back in the U.S., former Vice President and 2020 presidential candidate Joe Biden has come under fire from environmental groups and fellow presidential hopefuls after a recent Reuters report quoted an advisor qualifying Biden's approach to environmental issues as seeking a middle ground on climate change policy. Biden has sought to elevate his credentials as a centrist in a crowded Democratic field, with candidates touting progressive policies on a range of issues, including support for a Green New Deal. Biden supports remaining in the Paris Climate Agreement and reinstating Obama-era regulations on vehicles and coal plants while retaining nuclear energy and natural gas production. The Sunrise Movement issued a statement saying, quote, "A middle ground policy that's supportive of more fossil fuel development is a death sentence for our generation and the millions of people on the front lines of the climate crisis." Similarly, Senator Bernie Sanders, who supports the Green New Deal, tweeted, "There is no middle ground when it comes to climate policy." Democratic lawmakers, Senator Sanders, New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Senator Ed Markey are joining a rally today at Howard University in Washington, D.C., as the final stop on Sunrise Movement's nationwide Road to a Green New Deal tour. In more news from Capitol Hill, Senator Bernie Sanders and Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced legislation that would help millions of Americans saddled with credit card debt by capping credit interest rates at 15%. This is Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez speaking alongside Senator Sanders last Thursday.
When everyday banks start to charge higher and higher interest rates, essentially, your credit card becomes a payday loan. And this is not anything radical, because we had these laws for a very long time in red states. We had them in blue states. We had them in half of the United States, had usury laws until 1978 when they were repealed. And ever since then, it's given a blank check for credit card companies and for big banks to charge extortion-level interest rates to the poor.
House Ways and Means Committee Chair Richard Neal issued subpoenas for President Trump's tax returns after the Treasury Department failed to comply with a request to hand over the records by Monday of last week. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin wrote in a letter last week, "The request lacks a legitimate legislative purpose. If the Treasury and IRS continue to withhold the tax records, the battle will likely head to the courts." The House passed a $19 billion relief bill Friday, despite President Trump's objection to the package over its funding for assistance to Puerto Rico. The legislation includes $600 million in nutrition assistance to Puerto Rico, a number that Democrats previously said was too low to adequately aid the many Puerto Ricans still recovering from the devastation of Hurricane Maria. A similar proposal in the Senate stalled last month. Trump has continuously lashed out at Puerto Rico's political leaders, accusing them of misusing federal funds. Last year, he reportedly told White House officials he wanted to withhold any additional recovery assistance from the island. Hollywood actors are threatening to boycott the state of Georgia after Republican Governor Brian Kemp signed one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country last week. The law bans abortion when a fetal heartbeat can be detected, which often occurs at around 6 weeks into pregnancy, before many women even realize they're pregnant. In response, entertainers, including Amy Schumer, Christina Applegate, Alec Baldwin, and Alyssa Milano, pledged to boycott movie and television production in Georgia if the law goes into effect. Milano also called for a sex strike on Twitter. Meanwhile, filmmakers Jordan Peele and J.J. Abrams vowed to donate 100% of the fees from their new HBO series, Lovecraft Country, that's set to film in Georgia, to the ACLU of Georgia and Fair Fight Georgia. And in Tulsa, Oklahoma, city officials have formed a committee to oversee the search for mass graves from the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. On May 31st, 1921, a white mob killed as many as 300 people, most of them black, after a black man was accused of assaulting a white elevator operator. Over 2 days, white mobs set fire to homes, businesses, and churches in Greenwood, a thriving African-American business district known at the time as Black Wall Street. The massacre was largely overlooked by most Americans at the time, but local community leaders in Tulsa are ramping up efforts to uncover mass graves and seeking to bring public awareness to the area's history as the 100-year anniversary of the massacre approaches. To see Democracy Now!'s coverage of the Tulsa race riot, go to DemocracyNow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Narmeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. In India, the 6th phase of voting has concluded in a highly anticipated parliamentary election that's widely seen as a referendum on Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's seeking a second term in office. More than 100 million people were eligible to vote in this penultimate phase. India's Election Commission reported voter turnout was just over 63%. The turnout in the first 5 phases averaged 67%, roughly the same as in the 2014 elections that brought Modi to power. India is the world's largest democracy with 900 million eligible voters. The final phase of voting will take place on May 19th, and vote counting will begin on the 23rd. Modi's Hindu nationalist BJP won a landslide victory in 2014. Modi's main opponent in this election is Rahul Gandhi's Congress Party. Gandhi's father, grandmother, and great-grandfather have all served as Prime Minister of India.
Modi's government has been criticized for a crackdown on civil society, targeting political opponents, journalists, human rights activists, lawyers, and writers. Human rights groups have also raised the alarm on attacks against vulnerable populations, especially Dalits and Muslims. To talk more about the elections, as well as other issues, from Kashmir to capitalism to climate change, we're joined by world-renowned, award-winning Indian writer Arundhati Roy. She won the Booker Prize in 1997 for her first novel, The God of Small Things. Her second novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, was longlisted for the Booker Prize in 2017. A collection of her nonfiction writing, titled My Seditious Heart, will be out in June. Arundhati Roy is in New York for the Penn World Voices Festival. She delivered the Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture on Sunday night at Harlem's historic Apollo Theater. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Arundhati. It's great to have you here. So yesterday, as you were giving your speech, you were lamenting that you couldn't be in India because your city, New Delhi, was voting. Can you explain the 6-week-long Indian elections and how you see them as a referendum on the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi?
Well, the 6-week-long election, of course, has to do with the fact that there are 900 million voters, and just the logistics of that, dealing with the logistics of that is cumbersome and difficult, although I don't recall elections being strung over such a long period before. So there is more, more esoteric stuff in that, which I don't want to get into. But there's also a lot of anxiety in India about the election voting machines, the EVMs, and so on. But yeah, it's a referendum on Modi in a way because, oddly enough, he seems to have in his sort of desire to project himself, he's not just burned everybody else, but even his own party. So in many places there are people who are standing for elections who say, who people don't even know, because they just say, never mind who the local person you're voting for is, it's a vote for Modi. Now, what does Modi stand for, Of course, the core of him is the far-right Hindu nationalist core, and that core group will remain with him. But in the 2014 elections, he had added another layer, which was the layer of I'm the development prime minister. So the slogan in Hindi was Sabka Vikas Sabke Saath, meaning like development with everybody and for everybody. So a lot of people sort of forgot about his somewhat gruesome past and voted in the hope that he was going to, move India forward economically. And that never happened. He shot the tires off that moving car, with demonetization and this tax that you mentioned. So likely he's going to lose that second layer that he had put on, the fur coat that he had put on, the business suit that he had put on for the previous elections. And now he's just campaigning brazenly on Hindu nationalism, on national security, on terrorism, and all of that. So he's likely going to rally his base, but lose the support that actually brought him into power last time.
So can you explain, Arundhati, his main rival, Rahul Gandhi? Last night when you spoke at the Apollo Theatre, you said that even though you'd previously been very critical of the Congress Party, you've been impressed with Rahul Gandhi and his campaigning in this election. So could you explain what he stands for, what the Congress Party is proposing, and why you think he may actually beat Narendra Modi?
Okay, so this is not true that Rahul Gandhi is the main rival. The Rahul Gandhi is surely being, the Congress Party is the only other sort of national party. But in fact, what has happened is very interesting because the BJP and the Hindu nationalists have this centrifugal force that's rallying around Modi. And the force that's against him is actually dispersing into a kind of federalism, So what is likely to happen is that the Congress will be the glue that holds together a whole lot of regional political parties who are the ones, especially in, let's say, UP, in the biggest, most populous state in India, Uttar Pradesh, which sends most members to parliament, which would be crucial for any party to win. The Congress has no presence, literally no presence in UP. It will be regional political parties which will actually eventually defeat Modi, and then there'll be a coalition which will be held together by the Congress. But Rahul Gandhi, of course, as you said, he comes from the Gandhi family, and the Congress is a party that I myself have written against. When they were in power, Rahul Gandhi was a very sorry figure in the 2014 elections. But I've been very impressed by how he didn't really have power. He was not the secretary of the party at the time. Now he's the secretary of the party, and yes, he comes from a kind of entitled political dynasty.
Explain who he comes from.
Well, he's the grandson of Indira Gandhi, who was the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru. So it's a long line of the founders of, modern Indian politics in some ways. They did a lot of right and a lot of wrong, and went down. Rahul Gandhi went down, and he has had to fight his way back. In a way, his legacy has been more of a disadvantage in some ways, So I admire anybody who's been able to come back in that way. He's been able to actually drag the discourse of Hindu nationalism and this cretinized conversation about, if you look at the kind of things that the BJP are saying in campaigning, the members of parliament, people who are standing, saying things like we will shave all the Muslims and force them to become Hindu, and the level of the discourse there, and especially through this manifesto, which has sort of rolled back what I see as also a troublesome legacy of the previous Congress party, which initially was really very pro-free market, very, very pro-privatization, the privatization of education, the destruction of the environment in ways. And here this manifesto actually talks about, the right to education, the right to public education, the right, it promises a living wage to the bottom 20% of the population, which, you can argue that it's not revolutionary, but not revolutionary. It's revolutionary for a centrist party. It surely is, that kind of welfare economics. But when you look at the fact that now you're talking about people who just not even getting enough nutrition, not getting enough to survive, I think at this point of time, I do agree with the idea of a living wage, The BJP has sort of crashed the earlier, rural employment guarantee program. All of this, people who are involved in the right to information have been killed. Actors, writers, not actors, writers, journalists, activists. So there's something that is dragging that whole cesspit of, pulling it out of the cesspit and at least bringing the conversation back to a sort of sane place. And so this Rahul Gandhi has done, I think, and I admire him for that.
And can you talk about the climate for these elections? It's mind-blowing that they go on for 6 weeks. Most people in the world couldn't understand something like that. But the climate that has been set by the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, and also describe his background.
So he, his background is interesting in the sense that in 2000, soon after the 9/11 attacks, Modi was appointed the chief minister of a state called Gujarat. Now, whether it had anything to do with the attacks or something to do with the massive earthquake that had really devastated Gujarat, but actually Modi was not a member of the Legislative Assembly. He was not elected to office in any way. He was just appointed, dropped in as the chief minister. And within months of that, there was what is now known as the Gujarat pogrom, in which approximately 2,000 people were slaughtered in broad daylight on the streets of Gujarat. Within months of that, he called an election and won hands down. So after that, there's been no looking back, and quite soon after the Gujarat massacre, the captains of industry, as you call them, the big CEOs of the big corporations at a big meeting in Gujarat said that, endorsed him as their future prime ministerial candidate, because that was interesting, because they saw a man who I think they saw that authoritarian figure as being somebody who could implement the new neoliberal economic policies which were coming up against a lot of protest. And they thought, here's a man who can crush these troublesome people, not Muslims necessarily, but everybody who's now protesting displacement and protesting privatization. So when he came to power, he had the backing of the sort of crazed far right, as well as a lot of corporate money, And of course, after he announced the policy of demonetization, in which, like, overnight, he just declared, nobody seemed to know, not even his finance secretary or finance minister. He just appeared on TV one night and declared 80% of India's currency was no longer legal tender. First of all, regardless of what the economic reasons for doing it were, which turned out to be rubbish, but no one in history has ever done something like that, And it just, like I said, it just shot the wheels of the tires of the cars, the moving car, a moving car. And mysteriously, it completely devastated all other political parties, but the BJP has enhanced its wealth several times over.
I mean, in fact,
after
you've
that.
said the BJP has more money than all the other parties put together. So could you talk about the role of money in the election?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if you look at now you have to be a rich person to stand for elections. You know, you have to have a lot of money. And of course, the corporate, the corporate support would mean that, you know, there are certain corporations like Reliance, which is the biggest one in India, which owns, let's say, 27 24-hour news channels, or 27 TV channels, sorry. Now, so the combination of money, of a complete control on the media, and what used to be a complete control on the social media, you know, which has now been shaken a little bit. But so you know, I mean, if I were to sort of try and predict what's going to happen in the elections, the results, which will be out on the 23rd, I would say that no one's going to win. There's going to be a lot of bargaining to form a coalition government. I think it's likely to be a non-BJP coalition government. But the fact that no one is going to win...
You go against the polls on that.
Well, the polls might be older, but, you know, I think there's a... Yeah, I do go against the polls if they are... If those are the polls. Certainly, I don't think they're going to win. But I just want to say that I think the fact that no one is going to win is a great victory. A great victory, because it just looked like this juggernaut would just crash through us and stay there for years and years, you know. So for people, you know, other parties, people who have fought without that kind of money, without that kind of media. And I really, I mean, I don't know how to explain it on an American TV channel, but I want to say that, you know, everything about Indian elections, everything is about caste. Like, if you came there, you wouldn't even understand the words and the language in which the analysis is done. And it's like in Bihar, they won't understand Kerala. In Karnataka, they won't understand, you know, Bengal, because it's all deeply caste-ridden. But so what has actually moved against the Modi government? And this is very important, because you too are facing a kind of white supremacist regime. The RSS, which is, so yesterday when I spoke, I said liberals and secular people have consistently played down the link between the BJP and the RSS. But the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, is a right-wing, proto-fascist cultural guild, as it calls itself, set up in 1925. And the BJP more or less functions as this parliamentarian department. But the RSS makes all the decisions. The Prime Minister belongs to the RSS. The Secretary of the BJP belongs to the RSS. Most of the ministers belong to the RSS. And as I said, it was set up in 1925. Its enemies are declared Muslims, Christians, Hindus. It's always been against the Indian Constitution. It wants India declared a Hindu republic. Now, against this RSS, which is basically controlled and run by, I mean, the Politburo, if you like, of the RSS are Brahmins, a group of Brahmins. And against this, what is going to defeat them is not Rahul Gandhi. It is a different mobilization of the lower castes, or the lower castes in brackets, you know, the Dalits, the what is classified as other backward castes. So it's actually a pretty revolutionary thing, a movement much deeper than elections. But I won't go on, because I think people won't understand here what I'm saying. But
and the internationalizing of what you see, the RSS, what they represent, Narendra Modi's relationship with President Trump, and what you see the comparisons are?
Well, firstly, let me say that it was not only President Trump. You know, even Obama came there and embraced Modi. Macron came there and embraced Modi. Trump hasn't come there and embraced Modi, but Modi has come here and embraced Trump. All of it has got to do with business deals. But below that, the connection between the RSS and very many alt-right groups here, there's an ideological convergence, because at the center of it is the idea of Aryan supremacy. And so they, like the far-right groups here, very much admire the caste system as the ancient arbiter of social hierarchy. So there's a lot of dealings and social connection between all of that, you know. A great admiration for the caste system, a great admiration for the fact that human beings are not equal, they were never meant to be equal, you know. So there is a convergence there.
We're going to break and then come back to our discussion, and we're going to talk to you about other things as well. You see Kashmir as a possible flashpoint, a nuclear flashpoint that people should be very aware of. We're going to talk about the latest news about Julian Assange. Sweden says it's reopening investigation against him. He's currently in jail. And we want to talk about issues like climate change and capitalism. All in this hour, Arundhati Roy, the award-winning writer, author, won the Booker Prize in '97 for The God of Small Things. Her second novel came out in the last few years, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. This is Democracy Now! Back with Arundhati Roy in a minute. Comrades by the Bant Singh Project. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
So, Arundhati, you're one of 6 public intellectuals in India who criticized the arrest of WikiLeaks founder and editor-in-chief Julian Assange in London last month. In a statement, the signatories of the statement called for his immediate release, writing, quote, "The journalism WikiLeaks and its editor-in-chief stand for is a journalism of outrage. Outrage against the injustices and atrocities that take place around the world, but also with an eye to factuality, substantiation, and precision. If the U.S. had charged Assange and WikiLeaks for publishing classified material, the legal case would have been no different from charging the New York Times with publishing the Pentagon Papers," the statement said.
In Sweden, prosecutors are now reopening an investigation into sexual assault allegations against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and are seeking his extradition to face the charges in Sweden. The U.S. is also seeking Assange's extradition over the publication of leaked documents by Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning, which showed evidence of U.S. war crimes in Iraq. So this latest news that just broke today, many people feel that Sweden has been under enormous pressure to say they've reopened an investigation on sexual assault and rape charges against Assange so that he will also be called back to Sweden. And that ultimately what he's most concerned about is being extradited to the United States. He has said he doesn't want to be sent to Guantanamo Bay. Why have you gotten involved with this case? And these latest allegations today, do they concern you?
Well, I met Assange a few years ago at the Ecuadorian embassy. I was and am an admirer of WikiLeaks. The trouble is, of course, that there's a sort of, these issues of sexual assault are separate in my mind from the idea of his extradition to the US. Now, I don't know, I'm unable to read what this new demand by Sweden is. Is it really to try him for rape, or is it because the US feels it can get him extradited from Sweden easier than it can from England, from London? I don't know. I don't know. But I think it's absolutely right that if you are going to send Julian Assange to Guantanamo Bay, then you're really attacking people who publish news that the world needs to know. Although the charge against him, they're trying to say, is that he was trying to help and encourage Chelsea Manning to hack into the Pentagon computers, which I think is a flimsy charge. Yeah.
Many journalists are deeply concerned about this, because when they are working with a source and the source says, how do I get this information to you? It is very difficult when the government says, you solicited this, when a source is trying to be protected and trying to figure out the safest way to get information they feel is critical to understanding, in this case, war, Iraq war, Afghanistan war, State Department memos.
It's outrageous, basically, because what about all the documents that Snowden leaked? People have published them. Are they going to be put into prison? What about the people who helped Snowden to escape? Are they going to be put into prison? Where does this end then? So it's a very serious step. It's not about Assange. It's not about whether he's a nice man or a not nice man, or whether he raped someone who didn't. If he did, he should be punished for it. That's a separate matter from this. And we oughtn't to get into this mess about, is it okay because you like him or you don't like him? It's not about him as a person. I don't know him personally. And if he has indeed raped somebody, he should be punished for that. But that is not the same thing as the WikiLeaks enterprise, and that enterprise concerns us all of us.
Well, Arundhati, I'd like to now turn to another issue which you also raised in your lecture last night, and that is climate change. Another award-winning Indian writer, Amitav Ghosh, has written about climate change in his most recent book titled The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. Ghosh discusses two key publications on climate change that were written in 2015, the encyclical on environment and climate change by Pope Francis and the Paris Climate Agreement. Ghosh points out several differences in the two texts, writing that the encyclical doesn't hesitate to, quote, criticize the prevalent paradigms of our era. Most of all, it is fiercely critical of the idea of infinite or unlimited growth. He goes on to say, quote, in the text of the Paris Agreement, by contrast, there is not the slightest acknowledgement that something has gone wrong with our dominant paradigms. The current paradigm of perpetual growth is enshrined at the core of the text of the Paris Agreement, Ghosh writes. Now, during your lecture last night, you said that those most responsible for creating the problem of climate change, quote, will see to it that they profit from the solution that they propose. So could you elaborate on that?
Well, the thing is, for me, it's really for so many years, people, let's say in India, have been fighting this very idea of progress, of infinite growth, of this form of development, which has resulted now in what we call jobless growth, what everybody knows to be the case. You have 9 individuals who own the same amount of wealth as the bottom 500 million. This is what infinite growth has led to, infinite growth for some people, So I remember years ago I wrote an essay which ended by saying, can we leave the bauxite in the mountain? Because I think that's ultimately the question. Can you look at a mountain and not just calculate its mineral worth? Can you understand that a mountain has much more than just the value of the minerals in it? And there is a civilizational issue, right? That for people who have lived there, have known that mountain, they know that it sustains not just the people. It's not just a question of who's getting displaced, but how does, for example, that bauxite mountain, which stores water and waters the plains all around it, which grows the food, which sustains a whole population, but it's meant for a corporation that's given the mining contract. It's just how much does that bauxite cost? Can we store it and trade it on the futures market? So. This idea that you will never question your idea of progress. You will never question the comfort of the global north. And by the global north now, and the elite south, and the downtrodden north, So it's like what I said, that the elite of the world have all seceded into outer space, and they have a country up there, and they look down and say, what's our water doing in their rivers, and what's our timber doing in their forests? So there is a psychotic refusal to understand that the survival of the species is connected to the survival of the planet, because this sort of progress is a kind of church now. It's not amenable to reason. So it's very difficult to know how any conversation of any real conversation can happen, which is why I said yesterday that the only real conversation that's happening is a conversation in which the language around climate change is being militarized, because the UN, underneath every conflict, which appears to be a conflict between a tribe and a tribe, or a country and a country, is increasingly climate change, is increasingly the shrinking of resources and people collecting together to claim them, and therefore the growth of this kind of nationalistic or identity or tribal politics.
Can you make a connection between the issue of climate change and the issue of the growing inequality in the world? I mean, certainly it's massive in the United States, and in India, the growing inequality has increased enormously. You have this Oxfam report that just came out revealing billionaire fortunes in India increased by 35% last year as the poorest remain in debt. But that connection, that link of capitalism between the two.
It's just capitalism, isn't it? That, I mean, is pretty clear now that any sort of attempt. I'll give you a very good example. Like a month or two ago, the Supreme Court of India, based on a case that a wildlife NGO had filed, said that 2 million indigenous people should be evicted from their forest homes with immediate effect. Why? Because that forest needs to be preserved as a sanctuary. But when, for the last 25 years, people were fighting against projects which were decimating millions of hectares and acres of forest, nobody cared. And it was the same people that were being displaced. Then it was for progress, now it is for conservation, but it's always the same people who have to pay the price, And when you're talking about evicting 2 million of the poorest people, stripping them of everything they ever had, there's little outrage. When the Congress Party announced that it's going to have a scheme in which 20% of the poorest people get a living wage, everyone just exploded. Like, how can you think of doing this? Because it strikes at the core of unregulated capitalism, Any sense of talk of equality or justice seems to just have the same effect that blasphemy has in religious societies, That is what capitalism has become, a form of religion that will brook no questioning.
We have to break again, but when we come back, we'd like you to share a part of your lecture last night with us that you gave at the historic Apollo Theater in Harlem. Arundhati Roy, the great writer who has written 2 novels and many books of essays. Her most recent, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, The God of Small Things, before that. And soon her book, The Seditious Heart, will be out. Stay with us.
अब बहुत बेटे चुपचाप क्या घंटे का इंसाफ देश कैसे होगा साफ इनकी नियत में है दाग सिर्फ करते रहेंगे बात अलग शक्ल वही जात वोट मिलने पर ये खास फिर गायब पूरे साल हाँ मेरा भाई ये तो नोटों की सरकार है ना नोट से बनाते अपने बेटों को ये स्टार है ना कितने बेकार क्यों ये आपस में झनकार है ना बाकी पूरा देश डूबे इनकी नैया पार है ना अच्छी विद्या चाहिए अच्छा खासा माल देना नल में पानी चाहिए खड़े रेले लाइन में ना जमीन अपनी पर नोट दिखाकर साइन लेना ड्रग्स लाए ये फिर ढकेल देंगे क्राइम पे ना अकेला इंसान फिर गाड़ी तेरी 4 क्यों घर में है 4 फिर रूम्स तेरे 8 क्यों पैसों से नहीं बनते कुदरत से हम खास क्यों तेरी पीढ़ी का सोच वो कैसे लेंगे सांस क्यों एक तरफ तराजू
Azadi by Divine and Dov Sharma. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest for the hour, Arundhati Roy, the winner of the Booker Prize for her first novel, The God of Small Things. Her second novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, was longlisted for that same prize in 2017. Now a collection of her nonfiction writing is coming out called My Seditious Heart. It is over 1,000 pages and will be out in June. Last night, you gave an impassioned address at Harlem's historic Apollo Theater. The address that you gave was called the Arthur Miller Freedom to Write Lecture, and you titled it A Place for Literature. Can you share a little of it with us?
Sure. As the ice caps melt, as oceans heat up and water tables plunge, as we rip through the delicate web of interdependence that sustains life on Earth, as our formidable intelligence leads us to breach the boundaries between humans and machines, and our even more formidable hubris undermines our ability to connect the survival of our planet to our survival as a species. As we replace art with algorithms and stare into a future in which most human beings may not be needed to participate in or be remunerated for economic activity. At just such a time, we have the steady hands of white supremacists in the White House, new imperialists in China, neo-Nazis once again massing on the streets of Europe, Hindu nationalists in India, and a host of butcher princes and lesser dictators in other countries to guide us into the unknown. While many of us dreamt that another world is possible, these folks were dreaming too, and it is their dream, our nightmare, that is perilously close to being realized. Capitalism's gratuitous wars and sanctioned greed have jeopardized the planet and filled it with refugees. Much of the blame for this rests squarely on the shoulders of the government of the United States. 17 years after invading Afghanistan, after bombing it into the Stone Age with the sole aim of toppling the Taliban, the US government is back in talks with the very same Taliban. In the interim, it has destroyed Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Hundreds of thousands have lost their lives to war and sanctions. A whole region has descended into chaos. Ancient cities pounded into dust. Amidst the desolation and the rubble, a monstrosity called Daesh, ISIS, has been spawned. It has spread across the world, indiscriminately murdering ordinary people who had absolutely nothing to do with America's wars. Over these last few years, given the wars it has waged and the international treaties it has arbitrarily reneged on, the US government perfectly fits its own definition of a rogue state. And now resorting to the same old scare tactics, the same tired falsehoods, and the same old fake news about nuclear weapons, it's gearing up to bomb Iran. That will be the biggest mistake it has ever made.
Thank you, Arundhati, for reading from your lecture last night at the Apollo. So, could you say a little bit more about, I mean, as the writer of two beautiful novels, as well as literally hundreds and hundreds of literary nonfiction, what you see as the role of literature in this context? You referred to it, in fact, in that same lecture, this context as a blitzkrieg of idiocy. And the other point you made about literature being essential, fiction being essential, to saying what cannot in any other context be said, and you cited Kashmir.
Well, yes, I cited Kashmir and I cited James Baldwin, who says that, and they wouldn't believe me precisely because they knew that what I was saying was true. So basically, I think, you know, to me, the reason I wonder sometimes, you know, in this age of so much, you know, WhatsApp and video and Netflix and movies, and living in a country where so many people are, you know, either semi-literate or illiterate, why is it that, you know, a certain kind of writing, like say my essays and even my books now, you know, they're translated.
Your novels, you mean?
My novels spontaneously into so many languages, into 51 languages in the case of the ministry, many Indian languages. You know, when I go to speak in places like anywhere in India, you know, literally thousands show up. Why? Not because I'm some superstar, but because everybody is looking to understand what is happening at this moment, when really the era that we think we know and understand is coming to an end. And this is the simplest way of saying a complicated thing, you know, literature is. And I feel that we, you know, the radical understanding now has to come from not thinking of climate change. Oh, I'm a specialist in climate change. I'm a specialist in river valleys. I'm a specialist on Kashmir. I'm a specialist. You know, this kind of compartmentalization is actually reducing the real problem that we have, because now you have to understand there's a connection between caste and climate change and capitalism and nationalism and internationalism, and I think this is where literature and a way of grappling with history as a kind of supple narrative is important, you know.
Telling truths, as you quote James Baldwin, saying it is easier to often tell those truths in fiction rather than nonfiction. Which is your preferred way of writing? As we move into your next book coming out in June, 1,000 pages of your nonfiction essays.
Well, you know, as I said in my lecture yesterday, you know, people, apart from which is my preferred way, other people have their preferred forms of my writing. But to me, they are both part of my body, you know, they are both part of the way I think. And I would only say that, you know, the nonfiction that I have written has always been an urgent intervention. And together, somehow, when I looked at it together, the urgency put together over 20 years creates a special kind of narrative, a special kind of history, you know, because even the nonfiction I see when I read it,
we have 5 seconds.
I'm always telling stories.
We're going to do part 2 and post online at democracynow.org, and there we'll ask you about Kashmir as a nuclear flashpoint. Arundhati Roy, the great writer. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.